Welcome everyone, and thank you again for joining us. Like I said, my name is Nicole, and we are pleased to have you here for today's webinar. ITSM Academy has been educating organizations in ITIL and service management for the last 15 years, and in DevOps and Agile service management for the last 5 years. We're pleased to have Jeff Rumburg present the future of service and support, a brave new world. Jeff is the winner of the Ron Munn's Lifetime Achievement Award, was named to HDI's top 25 leaders for the 3 consecutive years, and has served on HDI's Strategic Advisory Board. He is the co-founder, managing partner of Metric LLC, where he is responsible for global strategy, product development, and client engagement. As a leading expert in benchmarking and re-engineering, Mr. Rumburg authored a best-selling book on benchmarking and has been retained as benchmarking expert such as iconic companies as American Express, USAA, Coca-Cola, and Emory Healthcare. Very impressive, Jeff. So we're pleased to have you here. Like I said, being 11 o'clock at night, that's great. We appreciate that. So Jeff, I'm going to go ahead and let you go on with the presentation.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. We're going to be discussing the future of service and support today. This presentation is based upon empirical observation. MetricNet conducts more interviews in IT service and support, more benchmarks, I should say, in IT service and support than any other organization out there. And what we've done is we've taken a quick look at the history of the evolution of ITSM and IT service and support, and we've used that data to project into the future what we expect to happen. So let's get right to it. I do want to point out, and hopefully you're seeing my page 2 now, I do want to point out that there are some downloadable resources for today's presentation. The presentation itself in PDF format can be downloaded from the URL you're seeing here on page 2, metricnet.com/ITSM Academy. In addition to that, there are 2 eBooks, one on Service Desk Key Performance Indicators, and the second one is on Desktop Support Key Performance Indicators, where we define the most common metrics that are used in service and support. You will find for each metric that is included approximately 30 metrics for the Service Desk ebook and approximately 40 metrics for the Desktop Support ebook. You will find the metric listed, a definition of the metric, an explanation of why that metric is important, and then finally, some common cause and effect relationships. We talk, for example, about the key drivers of cost per ticket. We talk about the drivers of mean time to resolve, etc. So those resources are there for your perusal and download, should you choose to do so. Now, we all live in an $85 trillion economy. That's what our world economy is expected to be in 2019, $85 trillion. If you put together everything from agriculture to manufacturing, services to high tech, and our industry, $85 trillion is the total economy. Now you can see how that's divided between the major parts of the world. North America represents almost a third of that at 31%. Southeast Asia represents about 26% of that. Europe represents 19%, and so on. Now, IT, when we look at everything IT, hardware, software, managed services, all of information technology is about 5 trillion of that 85 trillion. So it's about 6% of the total world economy. It's one of the largest industries in the world. In fact, that $5 trillion is larger than any other country's GDP except for the United States and China. The United States and China both have larger GDPs than $5 trillion, but no other country exceeds the 5 trillion global IT industry in terms of GDP. Now, of that 5 trillion, 1.5 trillion is IT service management. In other words, a little more than a third, or roughly 1/3, is the IT service management industry, and the global IT support business worldwide is about $250 billion. So most of us on this call today, including myself and Nicole, are part of this global IT support industry, which now employs approximately 7 million total FTEs worldwide. So going from the general to the specific, what we're going to do is talk about this $85 trillion global economy, drilling all the way down to the 250 billion IT support industry and the 7 million individuals that are employed by that industry. However, it didn't start this way. Our industry had, well, frankly, very humble beginnings. If you go all the way back to roughly the 1960s, and by the way, this picture is not me, so in case you're thinking that's me, no, it's not. I wasn't even alive at this time. But the first service desks, they weren't actually called that. They were called help lines. They weren't even called help desks, consisted of a phone in a mainframe data center that would ring periodically, and the person who was in the data center or an individual who was in that data center would answer the phone, and typically there would be some internal user that had one of three questions. Either they had a batch job that had run or attempted to run and it ended abnormally, what was called an ab-end. So it might be a COBOL job or a Fortran job that ab-ended, and they were asking the data center if they could rerun that job. The second most common was connectivity. These would be universities or major enterprises, that is large corporations, that had a connection to the mainframe data center because not everyone could afford a mainframe computer. So universities typically and many large companies would rent out mainframe space through time sharing, TSO, time sharing option. And if they lost connectivity, they would call the data center, and the data center would attempt to determine where that break in the line was and repair that connectivity. And then the third, and this is somewhat ironic, the third most common question was password reset. Now today, 30 years later, 40 years later, still the number one category of ticket in IT service and support is, you guessed it, password reset. It's quite ironic because there are very good tools out there today that enable individuals to self-authenticate and reset their own passwords. But back when helplines got started, those were the three most common questions. Now, typically not very much value was added. The person would answer the phone, write something down on a piece of paper, put it in a cylinder, and that cylinder would go into a vacuum tube system and get sucked away to some other part of the IT organization where an expert would presumably resolve the issue, the connectivity issue, the password issue, or the job ab-end issue. Well, this is how our industry got started. The skill set wasn't very sophisticated. It was considered an ancillary activity along with running the mainframe data center, mounting tapes and doing that sort of thing. It was really considered not a very sophisticated industry whatsoever. Things have changed dramatically, though. If we fast forward 60 or 70 years and think about the traditional paradigm for service delivery in any industry, not just IT service, the traditional paradigm is people, process, and technology. The idea here is that you invest first in your personnel, you recruit effectively, you train them well, you give them the tools to be successful, and then you build common processes on top of that. Not necessarily idle processes, but that's the most common process model. And then there's technology there that automates some of the manual tasks and eliminates some of the repetitiveness from, for example, filling out tickets and resetting passwords, things like that. Now, this paradigm is changing pretty dramatically. If we talk to industry recruiters and experts about how the people component of this people process technology paradigm is changing, what they'll tell you is that the number one skill set they look for now is not technical skills or soft skills, but rather business skills. The number one skill set they're looking for when they recruit talent for IT service and support is business acumen. They want individuals that understand what ROI is, that understand how to put together a business case, that know how to make a financial argument and understand the economic implications of IT service and support, which we're going to be talking about very shortly here. When it comes to process, most of you know that ITIL 4 was rolled out in February of this year. So ITIL 3 was the reigning ITIL paradigm or the ITIL framework for approximately 8 years, from 2011 to 2019, but ITIL 4 was rolled out in February of this year, and so that's changing fairly quickly. And then when it comes to technology, you can't have a discussion of technology and service and support for more than about 2 minutes before the topic of AI comes up. Now, AI is not the only change going on in technology, but when you put these three things together, for the first time in my 30-year career, what we find is that we're not being led by technology changes, nor are we being led by process changes, nor are we being led by personnel changes. In fact, the change is happening at approximately the same pace in all three areas, which brings us to an inflection point in the industry. We're converging upon an inflection point, which is where we get a sudden change, not quite a step change, but a sudden change in a particular phenomenon over time. So in this illustration, we have time on the x-axis, past on the left, future on the right, and the impact on the industry on the y-axis. And with the convergence of these changes in people, process, and technology, personnel, looking for business personnel, ITIL 4, technology, AI, and other changes that are going on in technology, we are now at an inflection point that is dramatically changing the nature of the industry. Now, you've probably heard the term past is prologue. Well, that comes from a Shakespeare play called The Tempest, which was written more than 400 years ago. And in its most benign form, past is prologue simply means that we can learn from the past. In its more aggressive interpretation, it suggests that we might be able to predict the future based upon what has happened in the past. And I tend to buy into that latter definition. I think we can do more than learn from the past. I think we can look at the past, look at patterns from the past, and predict what is likely to happen in the future. And I think there's an apt metaphor for technical service and support when we look at the auto industry, which was dominated by the three largest North American manufacturers. That would be Chrysler, General Motors, and Ford. They dominated the world auto manufacturing industry until about 1970. Now, at that time, in inflation-adjusted dollars, those that worked on the assembly line carried a wrench, wore coveralls, considered, blue-collar laborers. They made the equivalent of about $125,000 a year in today's dollars. It was a different figure back then, but inflation-adjusted, it was about $125,000 a year. And the U.S. auto industry had become fairly complacent. They were, for lack of a better description, they were kind of fat and lazy because there wasn't a whole lot of competition, and they had become bloated. They had become relatively uncompetitive. And potential auto manufacturers worldwide, particularly in Japan, recognized this, and they realized that their labor costs were quite a bit less than General Motors and Chrysler and Ford's labor costs. At that time, Japan was still recovering. Keep in mind, this was 25 years after the end of World War II, and they were still rebuilding their economy following World War II, and labor rates in Japan were about 1/5 what they were in North America. Japan recognized that this was a potential opportunity for them to manufacture and assemble automobiles in Japan using much lower labor rates and potentially gain a foothold in markets around the world, North America, Latin America, Asia Pac, and Europe. And every day for 38 years, starting in 1970, and this number is significant, 38 years starting in 1970, large container ships would show up at various ports around the United States. They'd show up at the Port of Oakland, the Port of Long Beach, the Port of Houston, the Port of Newark, New Jersey, and New York City, and they would disgorge on average every single day 10,000 brand new cars. This went on for 38 years. You can run the math, but 10,000 cars a day, not a week, not a month, but 10,000 cars a day would come across the oceans from Japan and be disgorged onto U.S. soil. Well, they eventually, the reason I mentioned 38 years, by 2008, Toyota became the largest auto manufacturer in the world. That's when they eclipsed General Motors as the largest manufacturer in the world. So there was a dramatic change that happened during those years, and the U.S. auto industry lost its dominance. In fact, it would be fair to say that by 1980, even mid-1970s, 1980 for sure, the U.S. auto industry was kind of flat on its back. It was losing market share dramatically. The quality of their products was in question, and American consumers, as well as European and Latin American consumers, were buying autos that were imported from Japan. And it looked like the U.S. auto industry was going to die. It didn't look like there was much hope for it. What brought the U.S. auto industry back and other auto manufacturers in Europe was technology, and specifically automation. So there were bots that would weld the cars together, that would assemble the cars, that would drop the engine in the car. It truly was AI, these various bots manufacturing automobiles in North America, that brought the industry back to life in North America. So an industry that was left for dead around 1990, the North American US auto industry, Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors, looked like they were dead by 1990, but the innovations that were made really brought the auto industry back to life in North America. And that innovation was technology. So those $125,000 a year assembly line workers that carried a wrench and wore coveralls and safety glasses were replaced by robots that would weld the automobile and assemble the automobile. And those that worked on the assembly line were generally information workers. They would work behind safety glass and they would look at various screens and they would determine what the quality of the product being manufactured was. So the nature of the job on the assembly line changed pretty dramatically. The labor being provided was delivered through automation, through technology. And those that actually worked on the assembly line tended to be engineers, mechanical engineers, industrial engineers, electrical engineers, and the like. And they would monitor these bots. They would monitor the technology to ensure that everything was working the way it should. And when I say that past is prologue, there's an apt metaphor, an analogy here for what happened with IT service and support, which was dominated by North American service providers until about the year 2000. So when you think about the large outsourcers of IT service and support, the IBMs and the HPs of the world, they dominated the industry until about 2000, much like the US auto industry was dominated by American manufacturers until 1970. Well, what happened was, with a drop in the cost of telecommunications, and specifically VoIP, voice over IP, there were parts of the world, particularly India, and to a lesser extent the Philippines, that said, in effect, we've got lower cost labor in our country, and now that VoIP is available and the telecommunication costs are relatively low, we can actually deliver remote support from Bangalore, from Mumbai, from Gurgaon, which is outside of New Delhi, from Chennai and other Indian cities, and from Manila and Cebu for that matter. We can deliver this product, this service, if you will, remotely from a lower cost part of the world where the wage rates are significantly less than what they are in North America. And so what we began to see in the 1990s, and it increased in intensity by 2000, was a massive offshoring of level one technical service and support, primarily to India, but also to the Philippines, Eastern Europe, and then nearshore, Latin America, and to a lesser extent, Canada. So the metaphor here is that the auto industry, which had become relatively non-competitive due to high labor rates, ended up being taken over by Japanese auto manufacturers. And in much the same vein, level one support, which was dominated by the big tech manufacturers, IBM, HP, and others, until about 2000, was largely pushed offshore, or a large portion of it was pushed offshore to low-cost labor regions of the world. What has breathed new life into the tech support industry, particularly at level one in North America, is in fact technology and the advent of automation. We're talking about chat bots and voice bots. Both are considered AI. We consider AI to be a separate channel from voice, walk-up, email, web submit, or self-help, self-service. But really, technology is what has turned the tide, and what we see now is reshoring happening at a quicker rate than offshoring. For the first time, this began to happen around 2015. We began to see reshoring happening at a quicker rate than offshoring was happening, and it was largely due to these technology innovations. So if we look at the past, we can learn a lot about the future of IT service and support by looking at the auto industry and what happened to them during the 38 years between 1970 and 2008. So we can connect the dots and take a look into the future. We can look out over the horizon and make reasonable assumptions about what the future of service and support is going to look like. And let me quickly summarize for you that number one, first principles, which are better, faster, cheaper, the three dimensions of success, cost, quality, cycle time, those still matter. Those aren't going to change. So regardless of what happens in the future of service and support, we can rely upon these first principles. They're almost like laws of physics when it comes to service and support. Better, faster, cheaper, the three dimensions of competition, cycle time, quality, and cost are still going to matter. Secondly, what we're seeing is that service and support is increasingly being viewed and managed as a business within a business. So even if you're providing enterprise support within a large organization, you can think of your service desk and your desktop support as an internal business. And the most successful support organizations do think and act like true businesses. They think and act like they've got their own P&L. They might be internal to an enterprise, in which case they'd be considered a value center, but they still think and act like businesses. This is a more common paradigm, and we find almost inevitably that the best performing support organizations do operate as internal businesses, staffed by business people. And ROI is becoming an increasingly important measure of success. Historically, ROI was really just an abstraction. People would talk about the ROI of service and support, and it was an article of faith that service and support had some kind of positive ROI, but no one was really able to prove that. We do now have a credible methodology for determining the ROI of service and support, and it is becoming an increasingly important metric. In fact, I would argue that the ROI of service and support is probably the single most important metric in service and support. Far more important than cost per ticket, customer satisfaction, first contact resolution rate, mean time to resolve, or some of the other common metrics that you see in service and support. Industry literacy will become paramount, and this really translates into metrics literacy. And there's two components of that. One of them is what I would call situational awareness, that is understanding the environment that you operate in. And the second is understanding the cause and effect relationships of the most important metrics in service and support. Now, technology, people like to say that technology is going to be disruptive. Technology in this industry, service and support, will not be disruptive. The technologies used in service and support always come from other industries. This is true of ticketing systems. It's true of remote diagnostic tools, think BOMGAR and LogMeIn, for example. It's true of knowledge management. These technologies come from other industries, and we see them coming a mile away. They are not disruptive by any stretch of the imagination. Paradigms, however, are disruptive. And one of those disruptive paradigms is that ITIL hacks are becoming commonplace. In fact, ITIL hacks, in lieu of going through laborious ITIL certification, ITIL training, ITIL audits, ITIL assessments, ITIL hacks are becoming the norm. And I'll explain why when I get to this part of our discussion today. Channel mix will continue to accelerate away from voice and into lower cost channels. Chat is lower cost than voice. Email and web tickets are lower cost than the voice channel. And AI and self-help, self-service, of course, are way lower cost than the voice channel. So channel mix is accelerating both for economic reasons and for demographic reasons. And then new leadership opportunities are emerging, specifically in enterprise services. Think IT service and support applied to non-IT enterprise services like human resources, like facilities, like security, parking, and the other internal services that are offered. ITSM was developed in 1972, IT service management. You've got a 50-year head start on these other internal services, and now there's a once-in-a-generation opportunity for those in IT to step up and offer their leadership, their expertise from IT service management applied to non-IT service management. So let's talk about each one of these mega trends, if you will, that are going to define the future, starting with first principles, better, faster, cheaper. And what we've done is we've taken 30 years of data from MetricNet's benchmarking database, and we've mapped it onto this three-dimensional surface. And the three dimensions that are shown here are customer satisfaction on the x-axis, TCO per ticket, total cost of ownership per ticket. So that includes the cost of everything from self-help, self-service, level 1 support, desktop support, end-level support within IT. So an application group, a NOC, for example, field services, and vendor support. So all levels of support, add it all up, divided by your ticket volume, that is your total cost of ownership per ticket. Those are your two tactical measures of success. And then your primary strategic measure of success is the ROI of service and support. Now, we had this mapped out, and we got back from the organization that mapped this out for us, this three-dimensional looking surface. Initially, it was just in black and white, and we later provided them some additional information to try and fill in some missing pieces here to try and understand how do you ultimately get to high customer satisfaction, low total cost of ownership per ticket, and high ROI? And it turns out that process maturity is the real key to driving outsized results or outsized success in service and support. So process drives performance. You've probably heard that terminology before, or that cliche before, if you will. Think of it as two sides of the same coin. Process maturity is one side of the coin, and your performance is the other side of the coin. And the way you get to the green is good, red is bad. The way you get to the green, which is high CSAT, low total cost of ownership, and high ROI, is by maturing key processes. So the barometer or the thermometer on the right-hand side shows it as your processes mature. Think of a CMM model, capability maturity model, on a scale of 1 to 5. As you mature those processes and get closer to a 5, you get to the high ROI, the low TCO, and the high customer satisfaction. So better, faster, cheaper matters, and process maturity is what gets you to better, faster, cheaper, and a high ROI. Service and support as a business emerged relatively recently. In fact, I've spoken on this twice at Service Management World and at the annual HDI conference. And what we find is that the most successful organizations think and act like businesses within a business. They are value focused. They understand that value is created through shift left and through channel mix and by returning productive hours to end users. They leverage metrics not just for observational and reporting purposes, but they leverage metrics for diagnostic and prescriptive purposes. They tend to be very proactive. They're not content to just let the incoming call profile or the chat profile or the email and web submitted tickets and the self-help come to them. They're actually going out there and they're maturing key processes so that they can get to those better outcomes, that lower cost, that higher customer satisfaction, and that higher ROI. They are process aware, and this is what I alluded to moments ago, which is that if you understand that process drives performance, you're going to focus on maturing key processes, not necessarily your idle processes, although it can be that. There are other processes besides idle processes, but being process aware really means being aware of the fact that as you mature key processes, you get better outcomes, you get lower costs, you get higher customer satisfaction, and you get higher ROI. Finally, messaging, a key part of any business, essentially the marketing component of the business. Even if you're running an internal service and support organization, messaging is important because what we've discovered is that oftentimes there's a gap between perception and reality, and it never works in your favor. The perception is always worse than the reality, but you can close that gap between how you are perceived internally and your actual performance through effective outbound messaging. So you can close that gap, and that's what messaging is all about. But service and support as a business is a fairly common paradigm now among the most successful IT service and support organizations. They think and act like businesses. They understand how value is created. They leverage metrics for diagnostic and prescriptive purposes. They lean into the business. They're proactive. They're preventive. They're strategic. They understand how process drives performance, and they don't forget to propagate a positive outbound message. Now, when I talk about literacy matters, there's two components of this. The first one, as I mentioned earlier, is what I would call situational awareness. And by that, I mean that it's important to understand the environment that you operate in. And it's surprising how few IT support professionals really do understand the environment they're operating in. But see if you can answer these 5 simple questions. First question is this: what is your average monthly ticket volume? Doesn't matter if you work in level 1 or desktop support, either one or both is fine, but what is your average monthly ticket volume? Secondly, what is your average cost per ticket? Thirdly, what is your customer satisfaction on average? Fourthly, what is your mean time to resolve? And then lastly, what is your total agent headcount, either at level 1 or at desktop support? Surprisingly enough, even those that work in this industry can answer those 5 questions correctly only about 2% of the time. In other words, 98% of those who actually work in service and support cannot answer those 5 basic questions. I find that astonishing because if you spend 40, 50, 60 hours a week in service and support, shouldn't you know those 5 basic things? Shouldn't you know your average ticket volume, your customer satisfaction, your first contact resolution rate, your mean time to resolve, and your cost per ticket? You should know those things, just like you know where your kids go to school. You know your address, you know what kind of car you drive. Shouldn't you know your environment? So the first part is just situational awareness, understanding the very basic metrics of the environment in which you operate. The second part of literacy has to do with understanding key performance indicators. And what I'm going to do here is create a build, a cause and effect relationship build, showing the most important key performance indicators for a level 1 service desk. There's a very common chart for desktop support as well, but we start with the foundation metrics: cost per ticket and customer satisfaction, kind of the yin and yang of service and support. Cost per ticket is your primary measure of efficiency. Customer satisfaction is your primary measure of effectiveness. They're driven respectively by agent utilization. This is a labor-intensive function, so the majority of your costs are tied up in labor, and the more efficiently you use that labor, the lower your costs are going to be. First contact resolution rate is your primary driver of customer satisfaction. Then we have a tertiary set of metrics, which include first level resolution rate. We have agent job satisfaction, which has a direct impact on customer satisfaction and an indirect impact on cost through absenteeism and turnover. And then finally, we have the drivers of agent job satisfaction, which include coaching, career pathing, and training. Now, the literacy I'm talking about here is the understanding of cause and effect relationships. If you understand this ecosystem, these metrics all move together. No metric moves by itself. So it's a dynamic linkage. It is an ecosystem. And if you understand these cause and effect relationships, it puts a great deal of power into your hands, because if you're trying to drive down your costs, the key to doing that is to increase your agent utilization. If you're trying to drive up your customer satisfaction, the key to doing that is to improve your first contact resolution rate and or improve your agent job satisfaction. There is a strong correlation, positive correlation between agent job satisfaction and customer satisfaction. And by the way, the metrics in red, the 5 that are shown here: cost per ticket, agent utilization, customer satisfaction, FCR, first level resolution, and agent job satisfaction. The reason they're in red is because that's the 80-20 rule for the metrics on this page. Those are the metrics that really matter. So literacy has a twofold meaning. First, situational awareness. Understand your basic environment, those 5 questions I asked just a few minutes ago. And the second thing is understanding this cause and effect relationship diagram, because if you understand this, you can pull the levers you need to pull to achieve desired outcomes, presumably better outcomes, better, faster, cheaper, and eventually higher ROI. Now, as I mentioned earlier, no discussion of technology lasts for more than about 30 seconds in this industry without the question of bots or AI coming up. And the diagram I've shown here, a bot kind of chasing down a bunch of people that work in service and support, we have already seen displacement of professionals, individuals that work in this industry, even in lower cost countries. I happen to be in the Philippines this evening, which is one of the lower cost countries, and we see a lot of offshoring that ends up here in Manila. The same thing is true of Eastern Europe and in particular India, but the low cost bots are now successful enough to be able to replace individual human resources, even in low-cost countries like India and the Philippines, but they're doing commodity type stuff. And by that, I mean password reset, Microsoft Office support, FAQs. The bots are coming and they are starting to replace human resources, but they do need time to mature. Let me give you an example here of how artificial intelligence matured in one specific use case and how it is likely to mature in IT service and support. Back in 1971, IBM built a supercomputer that they named Deep Blue. And the purpose of this computer was to learn how to play chess and to eventually become the best chess player in the world. The original estimate by IBM was that within a year, Deep Blue would be smart enough to beat the best chess player in the world. But in the first match, a typical match in chess is 18 games. The reigning champion back in 1972 was a guy named Bobby Fischer. He was an American who was widely considered the greatest chess player that ever lived. Bobby Fischer played an 18-game match against Deep Blue and won all 18 games in under 90 minutes. So that ends up being, about 3 or 4 minutes a game. That's how good Bobby Fischer was, and that's how bad Deep Blue was. Well, Deep Blue kept getting better and better and better. But by the 1980s, the engineers at IBM who were working on Deep Blue and trying to teach it to become a better chess player realized that all they were doing was teaching Deep Blue how to play chess, and Deep Blue was not teaching itself how to play chess. And the engineers said, we're not going to be as good as the best chess players in the world, so Deep Blue will never become the best chess player in the world. We'll never beat the world's best chess player because we're teaching it to play chess and we're not as good as the world's best chess player. So we need to teach Deep Blue to learn from its mistakes. We need something called machine learning. And eventually Deep Blue did learn how to learn from itself. That is, every time it played a chess game, and it could simulate playing those games, billions of games at a time. And eventually it got smarter and smarter and smarter. And by 1997, 26 years after Deep Blue was originally launched, it beat the world's best chess player, Garry Kasparov. And every year since 1997, Deep Blue has also beat the world's best chess player. But it didn't start out that way. It took, 25, 26, 27 years before Deep Blue was able to beat the world's best chess player. Now, if you look at the branded bots now, we have Tay and Azure at Microsoft. We've got IBM's Watson. We have Core AI. There are probably close to a dozen pretty well-known branded bots that are being vended within the service and support industry to provide chat support and voice support, but they are not very mature yet. If you've seen any of these demonstrations, and believe me, this is not a knock on Watson, which is IBM's branded bot. It's not a knock on Azure or Core AI or anything else like that. But the demonstrations are not very impressive. And the reason is that a bot right out of the box, that is AI right out of the box, doesn't know anything. And so Deep Blue back in 1972 at least showed up with some knowledge of chess. But when you purchase an off-the-shelf bot, it doesn't know anything. It's got to learn about your environment, and you teach it by feeding it knowledge articles. And it learns from those knowledge articles. And the great promise of artificial intelligence in level 1 and desktop support is that eventually machine learning will take over and AI will get past a tipping point and begin to learn from its own mistakes, will begin to learn your environment, and eventually will become as smart as any of the technology people that work in your environment, meaning the level 1 and the desktop support and the field services and the end-level IT support people to whom tickets get escalated, and your field service people and your vendor support people. The idea is that eventually machine learning will become so powerful that artificial intelligence will take over all service and support. Now, this is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing, because what it means for the professionals in service and support is that their job will continue to become more challenging. So you remember on one of the earliest slides I showed you, there's a guy in a data center, he's waiting for a phone to ring, and when the phone rings, all he does is write something down on a piece of paper and put it in a cylinder that goes into a vacuum system. It gets sucked away to some other part of the organization where presumably somebody can start up, rerun the batch append or reset the password or check the connectivity. Eventually, the same thing is going to happen with AI. It's going to continue to eat away at the commodity end of service and support, but it will get smarter and smarter. Those that remain in this industry, that survive and thrive in this industry, that is, the technicians that survive and thrive in this industry, are going to be those that are the most astute, the ones that are able to stay ahead of the artificial intelligence. What will be disruptive, though, I said that technology is not going to be disruptive, and it's not going to be. Even AI will be incremental in nature. But what will be disruptive are paradigm shifts, including the shift left diagram shows the average fully loaded cost of resolving a ticket at various levels within the organization. You can see that incident prevention through problem management it's actually not zero cost. It actually creates value because it avoids a cost that would otherwise be incurred. And these represent the fully loaded cost of resolving a ticket at different levels within the organization. And I'm going to add a new level called level -2 because an increasing number of our clients are engaged in these search and destroy activities, meaning that they go out to the endpoints in the environment and they look for potential failures. They look for servers that are about to fail. They look for hard drives that are about to fail. And they even identify applications that are prone to failure and individuals who abuse the system. If you have an individual who's calling the service desk 5 times a month and opening a desktop ticket twice a month, or an individual who has to call to get their password reset 10 times a year, these search and destroy technologies identify those problematic assets, those problematic individuals, and also hardware and software that appears imminent to fail. And so we've got even a new level on shift left called level -2, which is search and destroy. And the idea is that the incident never appears, the service request never appears to begin with, because it's eliminated in a proactive way. It's anticipated and eliminated beforehand. This is a disruptive paradigm. We also find that ITIL increasingly is being hacked because those that have been in this industry for a while know that ITIL is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's built on training, it's built on certification, it's built on assessments and audits. But a lot of our clients are saying, we're tired of this. We've been spending tens of millions of dollars a year on ITIL, and we don't see any benefit from it. We're not seeing the better, faster, cheaper, and the higher ROI. Remember the three dimensions of success, that still matter: better, faster, cheaper, a lower TCO per ticket, better customer satisfaction, higher ROI. We're just not seeing it as a result of maturing ITIL. And so we understand problem management, we understand incident management, we understand knowledge management, release management, change management, and on and on and on. ITIL 3 had 24 processes. ITIL 4 has 36 practices. I was hoping that it would get more streamlined and simpler, but it did just the opposite. And so what we're finding is that organizations are saying, we understand what ITIL is trying to accomplish, but we're tired of the endless training, the endless certification. And this is not meant to be a knock on ITIL. It's, in fact, the ultimate compliment to ITIL that industry has bought into what ITIL is trying to accomplish, but they want to get there more quickly. They don't want to spend months and months, let alone years and years, going through training and certification and all these other things. And essentially what they're doing is saying, we're going to stand up knowledge management, and we want to see results within a week. We want to see a reduced handle time, a higher first contact resolution rate, and a higher first level resolution rate. Or they're standing up a Tiger team, the name that one of our clients gave to their problem management team, and they're saying, we want to see a reduction in incident volume within 5 days. In other words, we're not going to go through all this training and certification. We know what we're after. We know our unique environment. And so we're going to take a shortcut here, and we're going to go directly to eliminating incidents, which is, effectively what problem management is all about. And then when incident management, end-to-end management of incidents, we know the goal here: shift left as much as possible, reduce the total cost of ownership in managing these incidents. We know what the end result is, so we're just going to take a shortcut and we're going to go right to the end result. We see this happening increasingly, and in fact, the most successful organizations when it comes to getting results out of ITIL are the ones that hack ITIL, not the ones that go through all the training, the arduous months and years of training and certification assessments and likewise. Now, the elephant in the room in service and support is this: the primary purpose of service and support is to make end users more productive. You can return productivity to end users. And what I'm showing on this chart is that if you're lucky enough to work in an organization that has top quartiles IT service and support, you're still going to lose about 17 productive hours per year due to various IT-related problems, issues, questions, and service requests. And if you're unlucky enough to work in an organization with fourth quartile service and support, you're going to lose about 47 productive hours a year, because your average end user now has more than 3 devices. And if those devices don't work the way they're supposed to, you do lose productive time. And we were able to quantify that productive time. And what it says is that the higher quality support you receive, the fewer productive hours you're going to lose. And so the primary driver of ROI in service and support is not shift left, although that does create economic value. It's not channel mix, although that does create economic value. It is the fact that you return productive hours to end users. And so the number one goal of any service and support organization should be to make the end users, to make the customers more productive. And this can be monetized. And this is how some organizations get to 500, 600, 700% ROI, meaning that you're creating economic value 5, 6, 7 times what your annual operating expense is, because you're returning those productive hours to end users. Another form of economic value is channel mix. If you look at voice as a percentage of total, it's gone from 80% or almost 80% in 2007 to under 50% in 2018. Chat has been a big winner. Chat is gaining market share, if you will. Email and web tickets have kind of leveled out at about 15% of total. Self-service is increasing. Now, when I click my cursor, a new axis will show up on the right. It represents cost per ticket, and the orange line that pops up will represent the cost per ticket over time. You can see it's gone from around $24.50 a ticket down to $21 a ticket, largely as a result of channel mix, so deflecting contacts into lower cost channels. This is another disruptive paradigm. That is, by driving contacts into these lower cost channels, you can average down your cost per ticket. There is both an economic driver here and a demographic driver, the demographic driver being that those that are entering the workforce prefer the indirect channels of self-service and chat over the more expensive channel, traditional channel, which was the voice channel. The big opportunity in this industry is enterprise services, and I've saved this for the end because this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. For my entire career in service and support, there's been this notion that those that work in service and support really don't get much recognition, don't have the career advancement opportunities that others within the organization do. But this is your big opportunity. This is your once-in-a-generation opportunity. As I mentioned earlier, IT service management as a discipline began back in 1971 or 1972. It's now a 50-year-old discipline. And all of these other internal services like facilities and human resources and security and finance and legal and marketing, they can benefit from your decades of experience rather than have them go through 50 years of trial and error, incremental improvement, the way IT service management did. They're crying out for your leadership. They need your leadership. They need your knowledge of metrics, your knowledge of reporting, your knowledge of processes, your understanding of shift left, your understanding of the metrics, your definition of the metrics. They need all of this. And so there is an opportunity for those that want to step up and offer their leadership, their expertise, and their experience to non-IT enterprise services. There's never been a greater time to work in IT service management because the opportunities going forward are going to be unlimited. I mentioned very early on, IT service management is about a $1.5 billion business. Well, if we take the IT off and we just look at service management, that's a $7.5 billion business. So the opportunity here is absolutely enormous. So past is Prologue. And what we're seeing is that the emphasis now is on business skills when it comes to personnel. ITIL 4 is replacing ITIL 3. AI will become increasing. And by the way, it's a percentage of total inbound contacts. AI handles less than 1% so far, which is why it didn't even show up on that channel mix diagram that I showed back here on page 17, but it will grow in importance over time. Now I've saved the subtitle for the end here, and we'll get to questions in a moment, but the subtitle of my presentation was A Brave New World. Now, many of you may have read that book. It was written by a British author named Aldous Huxley back in 1932. When I was in high school, it was assigned reading. And I didn't know anything about the book when I got it, but A Brave New World sounded like a fairly optimistic title and topic, and I thought it was going to paint a bright picture of the future. But instead, it was a really dystopian novel. It talked about a future of injustice and hardship. It was a pretty dark novel. It was a good novel. It's considered one of the 50 greatest novels ever written, but the title I thought was somewhat misleading. And to a certain extent, my presentation today was meant to rectify that in my own mind. And what I wanted to do was present a very optimistic future for service and support. So for those of you who have made this your profession, that are working in service and support, there's never been a better time, because the skills that will be demanded of you going forward mean that there will be unprecedented job opportunities, not just in IT service management, but in service management more broadly.